Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Tech Check Tuesday. And this week is part 2 of building your very own 4K video production system. This week, we're taking all the parts that we went over last week and putting them all together into our very own bootable, usable system. Stick around. Okay, so let's mount our power supply into our case. In most cases, the power supply goes in the bottom, which is right here. This is the back of the case. To mount the power supply, you'll use usually a number 2 Phillips head screwdriver for those screws. Remove any little plastic film that might be covering any of the parts, and orient the power supply in the case. Usually there's some guide rails to line it up in the back. You'll need to make sure that your screw holes line up. And then install the screws. So now it's time to mount the CPU to the motherboard and then the cooler to the CPU. This part you really do need to be careful because these components are very sensitive. They're sensitive to the touch, they're sensitive to static, and you just want to take it easy. Never force it. There's a lot of tiny little parts in here that you could easily damage or bend. So if it doesn't fit, don't force it. Take your time, get it right, get it lined up, and make sure it's working right. What I like to do with the motherboard is pull it out of the static wrap and then place it back on top of it. Make sure you remove any plastic film over any of the parts. This part here is where the CPU goes. In this case, there's a little plastic cover covering the chipset so that you don't damage anything inside. You'll need to remove that. So you'll need to make sure that you place the processor properly in its spot. It should fit easily and snugly right in there without any forcing or any pressure. Then lay the bracket over the top, push the retainer clip down, and lock it in place. And there, the processor is now in place. Now next, you're going to need to mount your cooler to the top of the CPU. In this case, I'm using a special oversized cooler. Whatever cooler you choose to use, just make sure that you follow the manufacturer's installation instructions to the letter to make sure that you properly mount the cooler to your motherboard. If you're using an extra large cooler like the one I'm using here, you want to make absolutely sure that you use the extra support bracket supplied by the manufacturer to support this heavy cooler on your board. If you fail to do that, you risk damaging your board with the weight of the cooler. With the mounting bracket in place, screw down the standoff screws on the top side. Be very careful not to over tighten. Once it gets snug, give it a little extra quarter turn, then stop. Next, you'll need to apply the thermal paste. This creates a good seal and connection between the top of the processor and the top of your cooling block. Distribute the contents as evenly as possible across the top surface of the processor. Use a flat-edged object, like I'm doing here, to distribute the paste across the top of the processor in a smooth, even coat. Kind of like frosting a nerdy cake. And, if you can, try to be a little bit neater about it than me. Then mount your cooler. Line the studs up to the mounting screws. then gently start to tighten. And use a screwdriver to tighten it. But once again, be very careful not to over-tighten. Once you have the cooler mounted, you need to make sure that you plug in all of the fan connections so that your fans on the cooler will operate properly. Now that you have the cooler mounted to the board, it's time to mount the board inside of your case. And this cooler is a honker. I really hope it actually fits in the case, man. I wasn't expecting it to be this tall. So now it's time to mount the motherboard inside of the case. There's these small little standoffs that have threaded studs on one side and a threaded opening on the other. And you want to make sure that you thread those into the holes all the way around so that your motherboard will stand off of the back of the case. So once you have the standoffs in place, lower the board in and then screw it down with the provided screws. Another step, you're going to need to install the back plate. In the back right here, where the ports on the motherboard will protrude through the back of the case. That back plate was included with your motherboard. It just snaps in place. Gently lower the board into the case. Be careful, don't let it drop in. Make sure the screw holes all align and that the ports on the back align with the backing plate. Once you have the board properly in place, you need to screw it down. You'll see the holes make sure you get them all and screw it down tightly. And in my case, it looks like I might have a little problem here. I think that cooler is going to be a little too tall. Once you've got the board mounted inside of your case, you'll need to plug the power in to power up the board and the CPU. Power for the motherboard will go from the power supply to this connection here. And one for the CPU, you can't really see it, but it's tucked up inside of there. The plugs will only go in one way, so if it's not fitting right, double check to make sure you have it lined up properly and try again. Never force it. And if you have a giant cooler like me, the CPU could be a little tricky to get to. Once those are plugged in, you'll need to plug in all of your front panel equipment to the motherboard, including the power and reset button. You'll have a bunch of pins on the bottom of your motherboard, like you see here, that all these tiny little cables from the front panel will plug into. They are all labeled, however the writing is very tiny, so it might help to get the booklet for your motherboard out of the box to make it a little bit easier for you to read and see where to plug everything in at. Once you have everything plugged in, you'll have a big mess of tiny little wires all over the place. So it's a great idea to get some zip ties and tie them all back and make it nice and neat. Not only will it look better, but it will also help you when you go in and add and remove and change your components around. You won't have a bunch of tiny little wires in the way, and they won't get caught in your cooling fans. Once you've got your cables all tied back nice and neat, you can start mounting your RAM, which will go in those little slots right there. If you have 4 or more slots for RAM, you'll need to consult your motherboard's manual. But if you're only installing 2 sticks to begin with, you need to install them in a specific configuration. Again, consult your manual. In my case, I'll need to install 1 stick in the A2 slot there and the B2 slot there, the 2 gray slots. Your RAM will have a notch in it, and that notch will line up to a notch inside the connector in the motherboard. The RAM will only fit in one particular way. Don't force it, and just slide it in. It has little clips on the top and bottom that will snap into the notches on the RAM here to clip them in place. Again, be gentle. Don't force. If it doesn't fit, try a different angle. You'll hear a snap, and you'll check to make sure that the little clips on the top and bottom have latched in. Repeat the same thing with your second stick. And there you have it. Your RAM is installed. Next is mounting the hard drives. In this case, it's pretty handy because these little trays slide right out, mount the drive in it, and then slide them back in. You'll need to mount the hard drive to the tray. You'll see little screw holes here on the bottom of the hard drive that will line up with screw holes in the hard drive tray. You'll see there the holes match up. Put your screws in and you're good to go. Simply slide the tray back into the case. Next, you'll need to plug the serial ATA or SATA connection from the hard drive to the SATA connections in your motherboard. One end of the cable in the drive and the other in the motherboard. Next, you'll need to get power to the hard drive. Use one of the many SATA power connections coming off of your power supply. Alright, we've got the CPU mounted, we've got the cooler mounted on top of the CPU, we've got our RAM installed, we've got our hard drive installed, we got the power supplies all hooked up. I'm going to be using a USB optical drive for now, so all that's really left is plug her in, load the operating system, and get down to business. Alright, now that you've got everything hooked up, your monitor, your mouse, your keyboard, your Wi-Fi adapters, you've plugged in the power supply and turned it on, power on your computer, bingo, and you're good to go. Now all you need to do is load the operating system. And that's going to be as simple as taking your CD, popping it in the optical drive, and following the prompts. Thank you so much for joining me again this week, and as always, if you enjoyed it and found it useful, please give me the old thumbs up. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, make sure you ring the bell and leave me any comments if you have anything to say or there's anything that you want me to show next. Thanks again, have yourselves an awesome day, and we'll see you all soon.